Voters, it's time to know your rights. Know that history is on your side. History has given you the right to vote. Voters, see yourself during the most important election of our time. See yourself casting your ballot and not letting anyone or anything stand in your way. See yourself as the voter with the most powerful voice, the voice of the disabled voter, the voice of the young first-time voter, the voice of an experienced senior citizen, the voice that is Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, the voter that is straight, lesbian, gay, bi, trans, non-binary. You are the American voter who cannot be suppressed. Voters, it's time that you know casting your ballot isn't difficult at all. You just have to know your rights. Voters, you have the right to a free and fair election. That's why our voice will not be suppressed. Your vote is your voice. Call or text 866-OUR-VOTE for more information on your voting rights.
Welcome to The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore. It is Sunday, October the 25th, 2020.
That is into center field. Here comes Kiermaier. Phillips has tied the game. A Rose Arena coming around. Throw home. Now he stumbles. But the ball gets away. Tampa Bay wins it.
On this edition of The Politicrat, baseball and why October the 25th has a special meaning if you are a New York Mets fan. 34 years ago today. And isn't it interesting that the audio you just heard was from last night's World Series game number 4 between the Tampa Bay Rays and the Los Angeles Dodgers. You're going to hear the audio of the 1986 game number 6 between the New York Mets and the Boston Red Sox, exactly 34 years ago today. On a Saturday, actually, no less, just like last night's game between the Dodgers and the Rays. And these games, at least their endings, are incredibly similar. It's a break from the politics just for today. Coming up next.
This year's election is going to be a little different.
Instead of one election day, we now have a voting season.
That special time of year when polls can open weeks before election day.
When your mailbox can become a voting booth.
When how you vote is just as important as who you vote for.
How, when, and where to cast your ballot depends on your state.
'Tis the season to be prepared.
This year, plan your vote.
Along first, behind the bag, it gets through Buckner. Here comes Knight, and the Mets win it. If one picture is worth 1,000 words, you have seen about 1,000,000 words. But more than that, you have seen an absolutely bizarre finish to Game 6 of the 1986 World Series. The Mets are not only alive, they are well.
What an extraordinary game that was. I mean, I can remember that game like it was yesterday. Literally. Yesterday, between the New York Mets and the Boston Red Sox. It was on Saturday, October the 25th, 1986, at Shea Stadium in Queens, New York. And the Boston Red Sox were leading 3-2 in that World Series. The Red Sox were on the verge of winning game number 6 and sending the Mets home on their own floor. Turned out that never happened because of some amazing heroics by what were known as the Amazing Mets, the Amazons, in 1986 in a storybook season. A team that had won 108 regular season games in the Major Leagues of Baseball and had now gotten to the point of the World Series, the most hallowed prize in Major League Baseball in the United States, in fact, in North America. This was no ordinary Game 6. The Boston Red Sox seemed to have a stranglehold on the game. As a matter of fact, especially in the 10th inning of that game, they had scored 3 runs, and it looked for the world that they will have... the Red Sox scored 2 runs in the top of that 10th inning to take a 2-run lead, and it looked for all the world that the Mets were done and dusted. The Red Sox, with a 3-2 lead, looked like a team about to hoist a World Series trophy for the first time since 1918. But the curse of the Bambino struck the Boston Red Sox, because incredibly enough, in the bottom half of that inning, that 10th inning at Shea Stadium, the New York Mets scored 3 runs, capped off by an incredible blunder by the Boston Red Sox first baseman, Bill Buckner, and an amazing at-bat by Mookie Wilson. Listen to this. Here is the call of that fateful moment in Boston Red Sox history that will forever go down in New York Mets lore. This is the now late, great Bob Murphy with the call on WFAN radio.
And the pitch by Stanley, and a ground ball trickling. It is a fair ball. Hit by Buckner. Rounding third night. The Mets will win the ball game. The Mets win. They win. Unbelievable. The Red Sox in stunned disbelief. A slow ground ball went right through the legs of Buckner down the right field line. The Mets have won the ball game. 3 runs in the bottom half of the 10th inning.
That was the call from Bob Murphy of WFAN radio in New York. That was just an incredible baseball game. A World Series game that few who saw it in person will never forget. I mean, people will not forget that game if you watched it on television, as I did in 1986 in New York. I just couldn't imagine that a game would end like that. I thought the Red Sox had won that series. And the ball got through the legs of first baseman Bill Buckner. Mookie Wilson scampered down the first base line, made it safely to first. Ball just continued to carry down the right field line. And Ray Knight, not one of the fastest runners in the world for the New York Mets baseball team, scampered around third base, jumping up and down, his arms aloft, like a kid in a candy store, and he couldn't believe it. He just couldn't believe what was happening in front of him, and he touched home plate. Mets win 6-5 in the bottom of the 10th inning. Game over, series tied 3 games apiece. I mean, you couldn't script that. Hollywood couldn't script that. The next night was somewhat wild. The Red Sox had a 3-0 lead in Game 7 at Shea Stadium, going to the bottom of the 6th inning. And then the Mets struck for 3 runs to tie the game. And I believe they scored a couple more runs after that in the next couple of innings. It was just crazy. I mean, the way they won those games in 1986, the New York Mets, it was a miracle, quite frankly, that they had won these games in the way they had won them. And it was just a staggering accomplishment by the New York Mets. The Amazons. That was their nickname back then. I mean, the Mets in game number 7 had scored 3 runs in the 6th. Now, they were down in the 6th inning, going into the bottom of the 6th. Red Sox led that game 3-0. This was game 7, so there was no turning back. If the Mets had lost that game, that would have been it. Boston would have raised their first World Series trophy in 70 years. 68 years. I mean, and they were only, 12 outs away from doing that? Mets came back in the 6th with 3 to tie it at 3. They scored 3 more runs in the next inning, 7th inning, to make it 6-3 Mets. Boston scored 2 in the 8th to make it 6-5. Then the Mets scored 2 in the 8th of their own to make it 8-5, and that was the final score of a game that got crazy late. It was a spectacular World Series. It was one of the most craziest, wildest, most unpredictable World Series that I had ever witnessed. And the Mets had lost the first 2 games of the series and lost 3 of the first 5 games. I mean, that was just an incredible World Series. That went 7 games. One team had won 108 games, the New York Mets. The other team had won 95 games, the Boston Red Sox. This was one of those kinds of World Series that was competitive. It was gritty. New York and Boston, of course, no love lost for each other in the sporting world as well as in the regular world. But that World Series in 1986 was quite a World Series. One that will go down in Major League Baseball folklore forever as one of the most memorable World Series of recent years. I think that looking back at that World Series, that Game 6 was the turning point. And people forget that had that ball not gone through Buckner's legs and had Buckner just stepped on first base to end the inning, the game would have just gone on to the 11th inning. The Mets would not have lost the series there. There are people now who seem to forget that. And Mookie Wilson's heroics were very important. But had he not done what he had done, because he was almost hit by a pitch, I think the pitch before, the one that he dribbled to first base, that went through the legs of Bill Buckner. And had Mookie Wilson had been hit by that pitch, who knows? Who knows what would have happened? But I know for a fact that had that ball got to Buckner and he picked it up and stepped on first base to end the inning, the series would not have been over. It just would have continued to the 11th inning with Boston batting. And the way Boston were hitting, there's a very good chance that Boston could have got runs in that 11th inning. Of course, now we'll never know. But I guess it's all academic now because the New York Mets prevailed and did so dramatically because that ball was able to get through Buckner's legs. And because Ray Knight, one of the slowest New York Mets, you ask any New York Mets fan, Ray Knight was one of the slowest New York Mets there was. He was more famous for getting in brawls than he was for running halfway quickly around any base on the diamond. I mean, this guy was one of your slowest New York Mets. He really was. Ask people who remember those World Series games, who remember that season. Ray Knight was he was no Carl Lewis running around those bases. Not even close. But that moment in that 10th inning at Shea Stadium, the way that Mookie Wilson and Bill Buckner, were intertwined in baseball folklore, That whole moment seemed to be a slow motion moment. It all seemed to take place so slowly, but then you look at it and it happened so quickly. And Bill Buckner is no longer with us, but his career was never the same after that. Never, ever the same. And sadly so.
This year's election is going to be a little different.
Instead of one election day, we now have a voting season.
That special time of year when polls can open weeks before Election Day.
When your mailbox can become a voting booth.
When how you vote is just as important as who you vote for.
How, when, and where to cast your ballot depends on your state.
'Tis the season to be prepared.
This year, plan your vote.
Welcome back. It is truly incredible that this is the 34th anniversary of that incredible Game 6. This date, October the 25th, 2020, is the 34th anniversary of game number 6 in the World Series back in 1986 between the New York Mets and the Boston Red Sox at Shea Stadium. And what a game that was, as I've been talking about here on this episode. It just was one of those games that you just know where you were when you saw it. I know that phrase gets thrown around a lot. But when it came to this baseball game, for those of you who are sports fans, for those of you who are baseball fans, you had surely seen nothing like it before in your life. And I had never seen a baseball game end quite the way that one ended, particularly and especially in a World Series. It was one for the ages. It truly was. And so I find it fitting that 34 years exactly after this happened, 34 years to the day, that the New York Mets stunned the Boston Red Sox in an improbable and incredible comeback to get to even the series at 3 games apiece. Just yesterday, October 24th, 2020, we had this finish to game number 4 of this year's World Series. The two teams, the Los Angeles Dodgers and the Tampa Bay Rays. And the Tampa Bay Rays tied the World Series at 2 games apiece, and they did it in this fashion.
Phillips got a fight now. 2 strikes. Jansen. That is into center field. Here comes Kiermaier. Phillips has tied the game. Arose Arena coming around. Throw home. Now he stumbles. But the ball gets away. Tampa Bay wins it. Brett Phillips, game 4 hero.
That was Joe Buck on the call on Fox last night, chronicling that wild ending to the game between the Tampa Bay Rays and the Los Angeles Dodgers in Game 4 of the 2020 World Series, and that game took place yesterday on Saturday, October the 24th. This was a remarkable game. This game was in some ways similar to that game 34 years ago today, because the game was back and forth. This game was really lively, like that particular game was an incident filled. There was a lot going on, and it looked as if the LA Dodgers were going to win the game. It really did. 7-6 lead, 2 out, 2 on. there was a controversial call that was made for a strike by the umpire last night on one of the Tampa Bay Ray hitters, and that actually hitter, his name is Brett Phillips. It still is Brett Phillips, and he is the toast of Tampa Bay tonight. He is the toast, well, not tonight, but he's the toast of Tampa Bay today. He was certainly the toast of Tampa Bay last night. The toast of Tampa, Brett Phillips, who had done pretty much nothing in his career. I mean, in terms of postseason, this is his first career hit of the postseason. He came up and he did what you just heard him do, which was win the game with a base hit that really he went on to get a double from, a ball that got fumbled in right field by Ian Taylor, who then threw a strike nonetheless to, I guess his name is Max Muncy or whatever his first name is, but Muncy, who caught the ball and speared it and threw it straight to the catcher, Will Smith. Yeah, no, not the movie star Will Smith, and not the former San Francisco Giants pitcher Will Smith, but Will Smith, the catcher of the Los Angeles Dodgers. And lo and behold, the runner coming around third for the Tampa Bay Rays, who was looking to score the winning run, because the game at this point had been tied at 7, the runner coming around, Arozarena, I believe is his name, last name, tripped over, stumbled, fell over between third base and home plate. He staggered forward, got up, and when the ball came into the catcher, Will Smith, and Will Smith tried to put a swipe tag on somebody who was not there, who had stumbled, who was at least 50 feet away from him. And he realized as he was trying to tag, he'd never had the ball in his glove, and the ball flew past him, only for the stumbling Arozarena to stumble and rise to his feet and then just dive for home plate and just smash his hand on the plate repeatedly for the winning run, the 8th run for Tampa Bay that won the game in the bottom of the 9th inning. What a dramatic game. And you know what? My description of this does not do it justice. It really doesn't. A phenomenal finish to a game that left the Los Angeles Dodgers dejected. Had the Los Angeles Dodgers held on to that game, Brett Phillips lining a ball, fisting it off into right field, dropping in for a single that turned into a double, that scored the tying run and then got Arozarena around in an incredible way. The way that thing ended. Remarkable. But the Dodgers, had they held on, they would have been up 3-1, and tonight's game would have been basically a fait accompli, and there would have been no juice whatsoever going into that game, because 3-1, who's watching that World Series? Now you've got 2-2 and a pivotal game number 5 tonight from Arlington in Texas at Globe Life Stadium, a brand new stadium that was built over the last God knows how long, but it's just literally across the street from the ballpark at Arlington, which is still intact. No word yet on whether it's going to be knocked down and used for parking lots or whatnot, or whatever, housing, or I'm assuming it will be knocked down. I hope it's going to house some people, but you know how that works. That could be proven wrong. But the LA Dodgers blew that game last night, and Dave Roberts, the manager of the Dodgers, did himself no favors with his poor managerial moves throughout parts of that game that really cost the team. Cost him. And like the game exactly 34 years ago today, the game last night, had the Dodgers got the out at home plate and Arozarena had been tagged out, the game would have gone on to extra innings. The game would have continued. Just like that game exactly 34 years ago today between the Boston Red Sox and the New York Mets in the World Series. It's just interesting how things happen. That was a really wild game last night. And even if you're not a baseball fan, had you for just 5 minutes watched that inning and just watched the way that thing finished, I'm convinced you would have ended up being a fan, if just for that moment. Baseball has the capacity to be very boring for some people, but for some of us, it has the capacity and the potential to be magical. And sometimes baseball is that particular sport where there is magic involved in the air, not just in a moment in a play, but in the air itself. There's magic going on. And that was certainly said of the 1986 Amazons, the New York Mets, because it seemed as if magic was in the air whenever they played during the postseason, especially during that 1986 World Series. And I dare say that last night for the Tampa Bay Rays, there was definitely magic involved. They were surely at the end of their tether. But sometimes the baseball gods have a way of rescuing you and welcoming you to the big time. There's one other thing that is very significant, I think, where there are threads between both of these games separated by 34 years, almost exactly 34 years. October 25th, 1986, between the New York Mets and the Boston Red Sox, game number 6 of that World Series that year. And October 24th, 2020, game number 4 of that World Series this year, 2020 World Series, between the Los Angeles Dodgers and the Tampa Bay Rays. And what's interesting about the two games is that there is a thread between them. In 1962, the New York Mets were born, and they were born out of the two New York teams in the National League of Major League Baseball. There's a National League and there's an American League. And the New York Mets were born out of the two National League teams in New York City who ended up moving to California in 1958. And they moved to Los Angeles and San Francisco, respectively. What you had in New York in the 50s were 3 baseball teams: the New York Giants, the Brooklyn Dodgers, and the New York Yankees. The New York Yankees and the New York Yankees and the Brooklyn Dodgers had a pretty intense rivalry. One could say that their rivalry with the New York Giants, however, was even more intense, simply because they could see each other's ballparks from where they were situated. They were close by, and there was no love lost between the New York Giants and the New York Yankees. Now, I'm not talking about the New York Giants football team. I'm talking about the New York baseball Giants, the New York Giants, who had a storied history, by the way. A storied history. But what is interesting is that in 1958, both the Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Giants moved. The New York Giants moved to San Francisco and took Willie Mays along with them. And that same year, the Brooklyn Dodgers moved, leaving Ebbets Field behind, leaving Brooklyn behind, and landed in Los Angeles, where they became the Los Angeles Dodgers. The New York Mets were born in 1962, and the colors that they took were the orange of the New York Giants. That was one of the Giants' prominent colors, orange and black. It still is the San Francisco Giants' colors. And they took the blue, which coincidentally, orange and blue happened to be the state colors for the Empire State in New York. But the Mets took the blue of the Brooklyn Dodgers as an amalgam of the two National League teams who left New York to go to California. And so the New York Mets are an amalgam of the New York Giants and the Brooklyn Dodgers. And that is reflected in their logo, in the colors for their logo. But what's even more interesting than that is that a voice that you heard earlier on in this episode belonged to none other than Vin Scully. And Vin Scully's voice, which you heard for the call of game number 6 of the 1986 World Series, exactly 34 years ago today, Vin Scully was the long-time radio and television announcer for the Los Angeles Dodgers. What's even more interesting than that is that last night's game featured the Los Angeles Dodgers. And in a way, the Los Angeles Dodgers and Vin Scully connected together again, and the New York Mets as well. Scully calls the game that the Mets come back and win exactly 34 years ago today. And Vin Scully last night saw his LA Dodgers, which he became a fan of after he initially had supported the San Francisco Giants, or said he would never become a Giants fan is more accurate. It's really incredible, the connection. That connection, and some might think it tenuous, but that connection is really interesting as far as I'm concerned. Do all of these things just happen? Is it all just happenstance that Vin Scully, no longer the Dodgers play-by-play announcer, he had been that for at least 60 years, if not longer. Vin Scully, who is now retired in all, intents and purposes from calling games, and is still alive with us, thankfully. That Vin Scully, who you heard his voice talking about 1,000,000 words, pictures are 1,000 words, this picture here is 1,000,000 words. You heard that earlier. That Vin Scully, who called the game involving a team that was an amalgam of the team he supported and still does support and root for, won that game in that fashion, while his Los Angeles Dodgers last night lost almost the exact same kind of game. And when Arizona, I don't even remember what his name is now, the guy that came around and scored the winning run, Arizona, I can't say his name. But the point is that when he came around for Tampa Bay to score that winning run, it was an incredible moment, by the way. But not only was it an incredible moment, it was one of the moments that will cement itself in Major League Baseball history because of the World Series, because of the way that run scored, and because of that incredible finish. A really good game of baseball. And Vin Scully's team was involved once again in an improbable way. But this time, on the losing end of things. Tonight, I can't say that there's going to be quite a game like the one that I witnessed last night or like the one that I witnessed exactly 34 years ago today. But what I can say is that the game tonight will be watched by many more people. Now with 9 more voting days to go. If you want a little bit of a distraction, just a little bit, and you're fed up of watching Netflix, and you're fed up of watching Hulu, or even HBO Max, dare I say, why not try baseball? Just, if only, a little while. Thank you very much for listening to this edition of The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore.